My name is Jason Braganza. I'm the Executive Director at the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development. As I said, this side event is being organized by the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, LIC-DSF, MENAFEM,
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. Just as long as it doesn't make its way to other places so that we can come back for the annuals. CETINI, the Institute for Economic Justice, the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, Debt Justice Norway, Jubilee USA, Oxfam International, Human Rights Watch, and the Center for Economic and Social Rights, as well as the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development, and Eurodad, the European Network on Debt and Development. So we're extremely excited to be having this session today, and especially at a time when there's lots of volatility and uncertainty in the world that we are currently working and operating in, and especially as countries and international financial institutions try to figure out how to find their way out of the debt crisis that they're currently faced with. And one of the big talking points, in addition to the common framework, is the role of debt sustainability frameworks, and how do they, and to what extent do they contribute to moving these processes forward or not, and the extent to which they also need to be reviewed based on context, based on country specifications, as well as taking into account more contemporary related issues. So I'm very pleased that we're having this session here today, just as we kick off the spring meetings here in Washington. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get into it. There is an overflow room next door. So colleagues, you don't have to stand for the full 90 minutes, though if you do want to test your stamina, you're very welcome to do so. This, as you heard, it is being recorded, and for those of you in this room who might need interpretation to French or Spanish, you will have to log into the call via Zoom and then get the interpretation that way. There is no live interpretation in this room. And just to remind everybody that you need to press the little button in the middle of your gadget here if you need to speak, so that the participants online can also hear us as we discuss and have our conversation. Just by way of format, we will have 4 submissions from our very wonderful panel here and Francisco, who's online. And we'll have 2 rounds of discussions before we open it up to get points, comments, clarifications, questions from your wonderful selves. And we'll try to finish off within the 90-minute allocation that has been given to us. I know sometimes it's not very easy once we all get going, but we will try very hard to stick to time so that also our other civil society friends have their allocated time as well. So with those formalities out of the way, allow me just to introduce our esteemed and distinguished panel. Online, we have Francisco Cantamuto from LIC-DSF. He's a consultant with LIC-DSF and an associate researcher at CONICET. He'll be joining us on Zoom. We have Imen Sharif from the MENAFEM Movement for Economic Development and Ecological Justice. We have Marina Zucker Marquez from the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, and we have Alison Holland, who's an assistant director here at the International Monetary Fund. No doubt, I know a lot of questions are going to be coming your way. So, not that I'm guiding you where to ask your questions, but my job as the moderator is to try and help facilitate questions and discussion. So, without much ado, allow me to introduce Francisco, who's joining us online, just to take us through his submission. And with the first round of interventions, we're trying to hear around, what you've worked on recently, Francisco, when it comes to issues of the debt crisis, impacts of high debt servicing, and particularly what role you've begun to see in this review process as well that the IMF is conducting with the DSF. So, please, over to you. You have about between 5 to 7 minutes, please. Francisco, are you there?
Hello there. I wasn't listening until now. Sorry.
Okay. Well, I was ceding the mic to you to give us your 5 to 7 minutes reflections on the work that you've been doing on the debt crisis and the impact of high debt service levels in the Latin America region, and specifically on the role of DSF in integrating things like climate and human rights.
Okay, there I go again. Thank you, Jason, and thank you everyone for letting me be a part of this event. My intention is to present some of the main... Are you listening okay?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My intention is to present some of the main ideas of a Latin debt report on debt, economic policies, and human rights. It might be said that, at least in Latin American recent experience, economic policies aiming to improve debt sustainability have not taken into account human rights in their design or application. In fact, they usually are undermining human rights. And I'm sorry to say, but the IMF has a key role in this situation. Latin America and the Caribbean has enlarged its exposure to credit flows, but this has not resulted in a net contribution to development. Quite in the contrary, it has facilitated the transfer of resources to creditors, enhancing their capacity to influence economic policies. Creditors include not only external investors, but also local elites. Their claims are usually understood as a priority to accomplish with the rule of law so as to respect property rights. But the principle of financial law, pacta sunt servanda, cannot be regarded in absolute terms. Its interpretation must be considered within a broader framework of legal obligations of states, including those rooted in international human rights law. Whenever human rights are undermined to repay debt services, not only social living conditions are harmed, but also affects the rule of law. It is not only that many debt operations in the region have flaws of legality, but also that resources obtained are not usually used to benefit development or population actual needs. If compared in aggregate terms, debt has financed different capital outflows, and the liabilities left force the governments to deepen their underdevelopment path. This is true in at least two senses. On the one side, government adopt austerity measures to prevent credit debt crisis, at the stake of reducing the investment in key areas protected by human rights law, as health, education, or social protection. Total public debt payments surged up to 35% of fiscal revenues in Latin America and the Caribbean in 2024, diminishing the fiscal space available for policies. Nevertheless, debt to GDP ratios remain above pre-pandemic levels. On the other side, governments apply structural reforms to increase both fiscal and external resources. This is relevant because reforms aim to increase the available budget as well as to get foreign currency. And to do so in short terms, the region deepens its productive specialization, overexploiting cheap labor force and abundance of natural resources. These forms of external productive specializations could not have thrived without human rights violations, especially those related to labor and the environment. How can the region develop if giving away its more valuable resources for nothing? Let's emphasize that Latin America and the Caribbean is one of the most vulnerable to climate change, despite its minor contribution to current situation. More frequent climate events damage the country's capacity to produce and export, reducing its capacity to comply with debt obligations, as seen, for example, during Argentina's severe drought in 1923. I'm talking from Argentina, so I can tell. This crisis reduced GDP and fiscal resources at the same time that demands more investment in terms of mitigation, adaptation, ecosystem remediation, and the repair of affected populations. Are creditors prepared to comply with these urgencies, or quite the opposite, will continue to demand payments and reforms? The region did not emerge well from the most recent debt crisis, the pandemic one. Only 4 really poor countries participate in the debt service suspension initiative, none of them overcoming their high risk of a debt crisis. For the vast majority of low, middle, and middle-income countries of the region, no alternative was built. The exclusion of private creditors affects especially to those countries. But official creditors did not help. Considering altogether World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the IMF, the credit contribution to the region was around 0.7 regional GDP per crisis year. In contrast, only in 2024, Latin America and the Caribbean allocated 4.4% of its GDP to debt interest payments. The region makes constant transfers of resources to creditors. How can it meet its human rights obligation? Of course, this is a brief summary of the complete report that you can find in LIC-DSF website. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Francisco. And what a nice way to start this conversation by, prefacing where the debt interest payments begin to outweigh, or crowd out public investments in public services that are linked very closely to that of the attainment of human rights, but also very much liked the point. Very much liked the point you made on. The point on labor and climate as well, and I think that's a very nice way of bringing this in. So I think there's somebody using interpretation. All right. And I think maybe that's a very nice way to sort of bring in Imen Sharif from MENAFEM to maybe just build up on some of the stuff that Francisco has mentioned around the diversion of resources and how does that impact human rights in the MENA region.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute to this session. Today, as we navigate the multiple intersection and intersecting crises of debt and climate and deep inequality, is more than urgent to ask not just whether debt is sustainable from a financial perspective, but whether is it sustainable for people and the planet. And we believe that DSA are not just tools or measure or technical tools to measure debt sustainability of countries. We believe that it's political instrument shaping economic policy choices that touch the lives of millions, often without democratic-like choices. And I've been asked to talk about the MENA region, and I prepared an overview of that situation in the region, and I think that I will skip this. And I want to speak about an event that happened last week in Tunisia, where 3 students died following a school wall collapse in the central town of Mazouna. That this incident provoked protest and accusation to the IMF, seeing that as a result of the reduction of public spending in education as a result of the programs that Tunisia has with the IMF since 2013 since Tunisia is not having any program anymore. So I think neglecting this human rights perspective and all the results of austerity measures and that the IMF was advising our countries to do, I think that needs to stop at a certain moment, and we need to recognize the impacts of. We look at tools that takes into consideration this impact. I know that every time we are with IMF representatives, they tell us we know that there can be difficult decisions that can be harmful, but let's stop and see what is more important: having macroeconomic stability, like just as numbers, or having people lives. Like I'm myself an economist, and I remember that the first courses of economics that I have had is like the economy is here, or the science of economics is here to find solution to people's life. That if we as economists we are not able to make people live. I used to come here to speak about the gendered impact of result of austerity, how women are doing more care work, but now I'm here to say that my people are dying because of the impact of austerity and because of the impact of the tools that the IMF is using to measure the sustainability of the debt in our countries. And I think I will stop here and I'll finish in the next hour.
All right. Thank you very much, Imen. And again, very nice case study and real life example. So we've had, the example of the drought in Argentina that Francisco has mentioned, the collapsed wall in Tunisia that has, contributed to the loss of life, and the attribution certainly to, the policies that the fund is giving many our countries in developing regions that are diverting resources. And I think, again, something that is not too far from the reality for the African continent in this sense, when you look at the number of countries that are in high risk of being in debt distress. We've got 4 countries that have defaulted on their debt. We've got countries that are very brazenly diverting tax revenues from investments in public services to debt servicing. The country I come from, in Kenya, that's exactly what is happening. Close to between 65 Kenya shillings and 70 Kenya shillings out of every 100 Kenya shillings collected in tax is being diverted to debt servicing. The rest of it is used to run government, whatever that might mean, and then the other half is also then left to supposedly development. So it's a huge problem that we need to look at. And I'd like to bring in Marina now, who's also done a paper on, together with the South African Institute for Economic Justice on this very issue on the continent. So Marina, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jason. So this report that Jason mentioned is actually a collective effort. I was one of the authors, and along with Ricardo Dorsey for Brigham City University, Kamal Hamburg from IJ, Patrick Najuri, which is a long-term IMF staff and also the former Central Bank of Kenya, and Kevin Gallagher, my colleague and director from Boston University Global Development Policy Center. So we call this report Diverting Development Path. So basically, we see Africa as a key, continent with such potential for development, access to renewable energy, increasing population. So it's a place where development prospects are very high. However, the current debt service burden are diverting this very important development path. And in this report, we did 2 things. First, we looked to the data. How is the profile of that burdens, that service in Africa? And then we looked to the international financial architecture to see to what extent the current international financial architecture is serving Africa to actually allow the continent to develop. I will start by giving a general picture. So what we saw is that although Africa debt stock is relatively low, overall, the stock for some countries, it's higher, but the average is below 30% of the gross national income. However, we cannot only look to the stock of that. What we saw is that not only in recent years that is that maturing, that amortization that the continent needs to pay, but most importantly, and I think this highlights the need of reprofiling and restructuring and debt relief, is that the continent borrows at very, very high interest rate. So in recent years, the average borrowing cost for the continent in private markets is almost 10%. If you compare this to how much advanced countries borrow, Germany, for instance, before the interest hike in advanced countries, so they were borrowing at 1%. The United States about 4%. This is substantially above the other countries, and this is the source of the debt distress. So what you saw, and above from this, because the continent was actually shut from access to external finance, many countries in Africa start to borrow domestically, but because of their markets is shallow, still a developing market, the cost of borrowing domestically was very high. So this is the reason why so many countries in Africa are spending very high share of their government revenues and servicing debt. And this is a problem not only for government revenues, but also for, servicing external debt. So what we saw is that on average, African countries, they spend 15% of their export just to serve external debt. And you may say, okay, maybe this is amortization, and that is, very high amortization in the coming years. However, 5% of Africa's exports is just to pay interest rate. So I think this highlights how interest rates are so high, and without restructuring, this is very difficult to solve. I think we heard a lot this week. All this analysis that we did was before the tariffs. We're expecting actually the situation is going to be very much harder for the continent because access to export is going to be more difficult. Access to finance is going to be more expensive. So it's a very complicated situation. And we are hearing this week a lot about the resilience, right? So the global economy should be resilient. I think we need to pinpoint where is this resilience coming from. It's actually coming from population enduring austerity. And what we saw is that in 2023 was the first time that that interest payments in Africa was higher than education. So between 2008 and 2023, interest payments, excluding amortization, interest payments to the continent increased from 1% of GDP to 3%. At the same time, education declined from 4% to 3%. So, and we saw the same with public health. So 30 countries in Africa spend more on interest payments than on health. And we expect that between now and 2030, on average, Africa's debt service is going to be 137% of their climate finance needs. So actually, if the continent had debt relief, they actually could boost much needed investment in climate. We see now that is a gridlock. Many countries. There is no low-income country in Africa that is considered low risk of debt distress. All of them is at least median. And what we see is now there is a gridlock. So we need to boost investments a lot, for development and climate. But investors are afraid to go to invest because of the probability of default. So, it's a gridlock that we cannot afford at this moment. I will finalize by saying that, so far we saw a lot of the population in the continent is enduring this austerity. I think, and it has been very resilient to actually allow the government to pay that service. However, to what extent this resilience is actually feasible, politically feasible? We may see more, protests, more, social unrest, and this is very worrying. I will finalize saying that, this is it's a large continent, and by 2050, it's expected to host 2.5 billion people is going to live in the continent. I think it's too large of a continent to fail, and we cannot afford for Africa to continue to defaulting on development. Yeah, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Marina, Imen, and Francisco, for providing that overview of different developing regions, and how the DSF and DSAs work to systemically and also maybe to some extent structurally undermine development outcomes, undermine to some extent also very clearly from the case studies that have been provided, human rights attainment through diversion of resources. Alison, I want to bring you in here just to sort of provide your reflections on the three case studies that Francisco, Imen, and Marina have shared, but also just to maybe signpost a couple of very interesting definitional aspects that all three speakers had in their submissions. None of them mentioned growth. They talked about development instead. And then Marina and Imen have talked about this concept of resilience. And I want to borrow here also from the feminist movements, because they have a very interesting idea of what resilience means. It means perseverance of what might be a bad situation. And I think in the context of developing countries, and particularly those in Africa, this idea of resilience, is it as a way of is it being potentially construed as a way to keep African economies and citizens persevering in this perpetual state of indebtedness, poverty, inequality, under the word of trying to do these different things. So I think as you react to those three case studies, maybe contextualize them also with the kind of terms that the three speakers have I believe, deliberately used in their submissions. Over to you.
So thank you, Jason, and my thanks to my fellow panelists for sort of setting out, such, I think, for illustrating, I think so clearly, the real depth of challenges that many developing economies are facing today. But I did want to sort of start and maybe kind of establish kind of a baseline that, we talk about debt and we talk about, debt servicing, but I mean, from my perspective, I actually want to be clear that I don't think debt is a bad thing, right? I mean, what is debt intended to do? I mean, even as we all run our households, sometimes it makes sense for us to borrow against future income, future wealth. And it allows us to do that investment that we need to do to kind of get to that future path of wealth. So, I kind of want to sort of start by saying that I don't see debt as a bad thing per se. The question is, how much debt? How is that debt being used? And I think, Francisco raised some very interesting points here. And I think, goes to some of the themes that I hear throughout the presentations is that, where debt can be used well, then, it should generate the returns, on development, on investment that will, lead people to better outcomes, and make sure that the debt can be repaid back. Because ultimately, we also have to remember that behind that debt are savers. I mean, debt is the channel through which savings in one area are passed to another area, and so behind every saver is also an individual, and we need to remember that as well. But I think the question is, and I think maybe this is something that Francisco mentioned, or something that, how can we ensure that debt is a force for good? And I think that is all completely intertwined with issues around transparency, good governance, accountability, good public financial management system. So, is it being spent on the right things? Is it being spent well? Is it, are we getting the most out of every dollar that we can? And then, when it is spent, how do you, as a government, make sure that you claim back kind of the revenues that you should be claiming back, right? So these are kind of all interlinked. And the important thing is that those efforts to kind of improve governance, the use of debt, etc., they also sort of play well, I think, with investors, with lenders, with creditors, and they empirically we can show that these elements can also help reduce the cost of debt, right? So again, we're talking here about the debt servicing burden, and I think Marina illustrated very clearly that debt servicing is going up. I think we have seen, and you'll have seen in some of our recent research, that we are very concerned about the rising debt servicing burden. We are very aware that the proportion of countries' revenues that is going to service debt is going up. And in particular, when I think about the current context, we see debt levels, they grew as a consequence of COVID. A lot of countries did what they should, which is like step in, try to relieve the burden of these shocks on people, but they needed to borrow to do that. And since then, we have seen countries, I think we heard Eamon talk about, austerity. We have seen countries make a very deliberate and strong effort to do fiscal adjustment. So we do see primary balances, which I think is a great measure of, say, the true fiscal adjustment. And those primary balances, the deficits have really reduced. So we've seen, basically the fiscal effort has been very large, but the overall impact on debt levels has been relatively small so far. So, yes, we see debt levels beginning to come down. They're not coming down as fast now as they were in October. But that's at the cost of a fairly sustained period of strong fiscal adjustment. So I think, as somebody asked the question, there is a question about how much longer can that be sustained? And I think, again, that comes back to this issue of trust in government, trust that resources are being used well, trust that there is, it is going to be hard. It will remain hard. I think as Marina mentioned, the current context is even harder. At the end of the day, the burden, I think there's an issue of perception of fairness, that everybody's feeling the same burden, right? So again, I think there is a lot more that can be done to build resilience in terms of just efforts to improve governance and accountability, then efforts to raise your debt carrying capacity, such as building more revenues, and there are ways to do that don't necessarily mean changing the tax framework, but it's about implementing the current tax framework more completely. So we see in a lot of countries that there are lots of carve-outs, lots of tax exemptions, that could be narrowed so that everybody pays their fair share. And again, I'm a big fan of good public financial management, squeezing every drop of benefit out of every dollar that you have, et cetera. But I think, again, we have to recognize that the need for debt will continue. I think we were very aware, we heard about climate issues. That needs investment. That needs new financing flows. And so it's more a question of how can we make sure that those financing flows are as good quality as they can be to minimize the ongoing burden on debt. But let me pause there for the next round.
Thanks, Alison. I do want to have a second round of submissions where we try and be a bit more solution-oriented.